Good day, everyone. Today, let's talk about instructional objectives. Most people would agree that the goal of education is learning, and most would agree that education is likely to be more effective if educators are clear about what it is that they wanted their students to learn. And finally, most would agree that if teachers have a clear idea about what learners are expected to learn, they can more easily and more accurately determine how well students have learned. That's where instructional objectives will come in, because instructional objectives specifically or specify exactly what is supposed to be learned, and they are helpful to the teacher as well as the learner throughout the learning process and are invaluable in the evaluation process. But what are instructional objectives? Instructional objectives, also known as behavioral objectives or learning objectives, are basically statements which clearly describe an anticipated learning outcome. When objectives were first coming out into their own in education, they almost always began with the phrase, upon completion of this lesson, the student should be able to. Now, this phrase focused on the outcome of learning rather than on the learning process. In fact, one of the criteria for a well written objective is that it should describe the outcome of learning. That is, what the learners can do after learning has occurred and that they might not have been able to do before the teaching and learning process began. So, as you can see, instructional objectives are very important. In designing a lesson plan, for example, we must have to state our instructional objectives, because instructional objectives is where are the basis of the instructional activities, assessment activities, the strategies, the motivational activities that you would like to give your students, and the type of assessment that you are going to give them. So all these are based in instructional objectives. That is why it's very important that in designing a lesson plan or a lesson, we have to state our objectives properly, because a faulty learning objectives would make or would not guarantee an effective instruction. So, as a future teacher, it is a must that we should know how to state our instructional objectives. Now, let's take a look at the characteristics of a well written objectives. A well written objective should meet the following criteria. The first one is describe a learning outcome. Second, be students oriented or centered. Be observable or describe an observable product. Let's talk about them one by one. A well written objective should describe a learning outcome. So for example, to correctly spell the spelling words on page 17, for example, in a book. It should not describe a learning activity. Okay? Uh, what should it should describe should be the learning outcome. Learning activities are important in planning and guiding instruction, but they are not to be confused with instructional objectives. So again, first one, it should describe a learning outcome. Number two is be student oriented. A student oriented objective focuses on the learner and not on the teacher. It should describe what the learner will be able to do. It should not describe a teacher activity. It may be helpful to both the teacher and the student to know what the teacher is going to do, but teacher activities are also not to be confused with instructional activities. So when you are stating your learning objectives, you have to bear in mind always the learning outcome, what the students are expected to be able to do at the end of the lesson, and not what the teacher is going to do during the lesson. Usually, that's the confusion, especially for new teachers. They get confused with learning objectives. Sometimes they state their learning objectives on bearing in mind what they are going to do in class, not what the student should be able to do at the end of the lesson. The third is be observable, or it should describe an observable product. If an instructional objective is not observable or it does not describe an observable product, it would lead to unclear expectations and it will be difficult to determine whether or not it had been reached. So the key to writing observable objective is to use verbs that are observable and would lead to a well-defined products of action implied by that verb. Examples, those that were written in your module, we have a lot of examples of verbs that you can use in your instructional objectives. For example, at the end of the lesson, the student should be able to graph exponential functions. So that alone is observable. You ask your students to graph a specific function at the end of the lesson. Now, what verbs should you not use because they are not observable? Examples of verbs are to know, to understand, to enjoy, to appreciate, to realize, to value. Okay? All these verbs are vague and they can't be observed. They are not observable. Okay? More examples of observable verbs: to identify. Okay? If you ask the students to identify the different parts of a machine, for example, then you can observe them while they are identifying the different parts of that machine. Okay? So I hope it's clear what do we mean by observable and not observable. There are many skills that cannot be directly observed. Okay? The thinking process of a student as she tries to solve a math problem cannot be easily observed. However, one can look at the answers she comes up with and determine if they are correct. It's also possible to look at the steps a students take to arrive at the answer if they are written down, for example. Okay, so there are many end products that can also be observed. For example, if you ask them to create an oil painting, okay, or a three-dimensional map, or you ask them to create a model of the different three-dimensional shapes, for example, okay, these are all observable. Now, let's move on to the characteristics of a useful objective this time. To be useful for instruction, an objective must not only be well written, but it also must meet the following criteria: be sequentially appropriate, be attainable within a reasonable amount of time, and be developmentally appropriate. For an objective to be sequentially appropriate, it must occur in an appropriate place in the instructional sequence. All prerequisite objectives must already have been attained. Nothing thwarts the learning process more than having learners trying to accomplish an objective before they have learned the necessary prerequisites. This is why continuous assessment of student progress is also important. So when we say useful objectives, um, before you state your learning objectives, you have to make sure that the needed or prerequisite objectives must already have been attained. Okay, so for example, before students can solve problems in the Pythagorean theorem, the student should be able already to define and explain what Pythagorean theorem is. Okay, that's a prerequisite objective. A useful objective is attainable within a reasonable time. If an instructional objective takes students an inordinately long time to accomplish, it is either sequentially inappropriate or it is too broad, relying on accomplishment of several outcomes or skills rather than a single outcome or skill. So an objective should set expectations for a single learning outcome and not a cluster of them. That's why um, instructional objectives should be specific for that lesson and time bound. Next is developmentally appropriate objectives. These objectives set expectations for students that are well within their level of intellectual, social, language, or moral development. So teachers, parents, and others who are working with preschool or elementary school children should be specifically aware of the developmental stages of the children they are working with. Okay? No author or researcher has more clearly defined the stages of intellectual development than uh, Jean Piaget. If you're familiar with Jean Piaget, familiarity with his work as well as with the work of other child development specialists should produce better instructional objectives. Or, in other words, our instructional objectives should be appropriate to the developmental stage of the learners. Do not set an objective above or way, way, way above the developmental stage of the learners. Now, we have the different kinds of instructional objectives. First, we have cognitive, then affective, and psychomotor. Instructional objectives are often classified according to their kind of level of learning that is required in order to reach them. Okay? There are numerous taxonomies of instructional objectives, and the most common taxonomy was developed by Benjamin Bloom and his colleagues. The first level of taxonomy divides objectives into three categories. Like what I mentioned, we have cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. So simply put, cognitive objectives focus on the mind. Affective objectives focus on emotions or affect, and psychomotor objectives focus on the body. We're going to discuss this one by one later in our lesson. Okay, so that's it for today. I hope you have a clear idea of what instructional objectives are.